Well, good morning. This is the Lew Rockwell Show, and how great it is to have as our guest this morning Professor Harry Veryser. Harry is a famous teacher of economics, today teaching at the University of Detroit Mercy. He's an associated scholar of the Mises Institute. I can attest to his ability as a teacher because I've heard him teach, and there's a reason he's famous. He's done so much to spread the word about the Austrian School of Economics, real economics as versus Keynesianism and the other frauds that we're confronted with. And now he's brought out a book so that everybody can get to share Harry's ability as a teacher about all these important matters about really the future of civilization is what economics is all about. Through this book, and Harry's book is called It Didn't Have to Be This Way, Why Boom and Bust is Unnecessary, and How the Austrian School of Economics Breaks the Cycle. So Harry, tell us, what did you intend to accomplish with this book?
Well, what I wanted to show with the book, Lou, was the fact that most of what is correct in mainstream economics today comes from the Austrians, and it's simply been ignored. For example, almost all the micro concepts that's taught in microeconomics today came from Karl Meyer and from Eugen von Bimbauer, and it was mathematicized by Alfred Marshall, and I think in a good way distorted. But the basic ideas of marginalism and value are all Austrian. This is really not recognized. In fact, the mainstream people simply ignore it. And I think that my purpose in writing the book, I had multiple purposes, but one was to say, hey, look, the Austrians were the ones who developed this theory. Secondly, I've taught finance for years, and that's all Austrian. When you start talking about the time value of money and time, that goes right back to the Austrians. And it's sad that the mainstream establishment now does not really recognize that or recognize their real contributions to the entire science. So that was the first thing. The second thing I think that I wanted to bring out was the correct predictions of the Austrians. Even though they don't believe in mathematical predictions, they have been remarkably accurate in their description of social events. For example, the fall of communism and the impossibility of socialism, which was Mises' major contribution. Hayek's concept of knowledge and knowledge at the lowest level. And Hayek was very instrumental in talking about that with the fall of socialism, how these large institutions do not have the knowledge to function. And I think that can even be applied today as these large banks understand Jamie Dimon lost several $1 billion and didn't even know it.
Where is that money? Yeah.
I don't know. He doesn't know where it went. And Lou, this is typical. These folks ignore the Austrians, and yet the Austrians were correct. The other thing is several Austrians were able to predict this trade cycle, the up and down. I think Peter Schiff or Dr. Ron Paul, I myself was able to predict it by using the Austrian trade cycle. And then they completely ignore the Austrian victories, particularly the revival of Germany, that was entirely done by Austrians. Although it's been distorted now with this awful EEC, which hopefully will go by the boards like socialism did. So I wanted to say, hey, look, the Austrians, first of all, they're the basis of a good deal of the correct theory. Never been given credit for it. Their predictions have been accurate. And when they've been put in charge of economies, they've been remarkably successful.
Harry, one of the things I like most about your book, and of course I like all the things you just described, and one of the things I think it would make it such a neat book for economics and finance courses, at least as additional reading, if not the main textbook, is the great job you did in finding so many unbelievable quotes from the bad guys that support the Austrian position.
Yes. Well, Aristotle one time said, and I think it's in Aristotle, I don't know if it's in the metaphysics or in the ethics, but in order to tell a lie, you've got to tell a lot of truth. And the problem is they live in the real world, and they have to say things that are true. And when they're saying these things, they're really backing up the Austrian school.
Well, give us some examples.
Well, for example, George Soros, whom I have disdain for what he's done to the world economy with his push into socialism or interventionism. But he comes out and says, right out, he says, mainstream economics didn't predict this problem, can't explain it, and has no solutions. And so here he is criticizing mainstream economics. A character like Paul Krugman has come out and said it's a colossal waste of time. John Kenneth Galbraith said economic forecasting makes astrology look respectable. And so these guys say this stuff, and they're recognizing the truth, but they refused to say, hey, wait a minute, now where is the solution? Well, the solution, obviously, is with the Austrians.
You know, the mathematization of economics that I guess we can trace in some part anyway to Milton Friedman and Paul Samuelson after World War II, although obviously they were antecedents, I should say, with Walras and Marshall and earlier. But in the American economics profession, do you think that there's a limit to this? I mean, it seems to me all the top programs and really most PhD programs today are almost entirely mathematical. It's maybe why all the students are Chinese or Koreans or Indians, and so they can handle the math. But it has nothing to do with the real world. I mean, so at what point is this whole construct going to collapse?
Well, I think it did, Lou, with this latest real estate crisis. And there's been books written. I think the Black Swan is one. The economics, I think, what is it called? The Alchemy of Loss. A number of other books have written showing that this thing is the big fraud that it is. I mean, I remember being in a conference with Ludwig von Mises back in the 60s at the, and I asked him a question about Friedman in the economics, and he waved his hand the typical Austrian way, and he said, Friedman is not an economist, he's a statistician. And the problem, as Mises points out, statistics is history. So these guys are, as someone said, driving, looking in the rearview mirror, and the car crashed. I mean, it's over. So, I mean, I think this will continue to be taught in the academy because the academy is becoming less and less connected with reality, and it'll continue there. But as far as in the business community and the rest, I think it's going to be looked askance. And people will say, well, these theories are wonderful, but it doesn't tell us anything.
You mentioned Ron Paul. As far as I can tell, he's drawn millions of young people to an interest in Austrian economics, not only in this country, but all over the world.
Yes. Well, Lou, I'll tell you, when I came down to the conference there, I stopped at University of Delaware. I was at Christendom College. I was at North Carolina State. On my way home, I was at Kentucky, Eastern Kentucky University. And all over, I'm finding that there's tremendous interest in liberty and in Dr. Paul. And there is absolutely no traction on college campuses today for neoconservatism or anything like that. I mean, the young folks have seen it as the fraud that it is. They're not interested in it. They're not interested in imperialism. And so I asked them about the left-wing groups, and there's not many left-wing groups left. So the real interest among young people who are thinking is Dr. Paul and liberty and the Austrians.
One of the key points of your book is to talk about the Austrian business cycle theory and its applicability to real-world events. You must think that's an important teaching criterion.
Yes. In fact, I have all of my students, every class I have, on the final exam, there's an essay question in which they have to tell me what I taught on the Austrian business cycle theory. And I said, folks, I want you to remember this because you're going to live through 3 or 4 of these things in your lifetime, maybe more, depending on how crazy the Fed gets. They're going to have to live with this thing. And I said, this is the essence of what you're going to have to understand in business because this thing has much more power than you would think. And Lou, in fact, I've had students write me letters of thank you saying, you saved a couple $100,000 in my IRA with your teaching. I was in a washroom once, and the fellow came up to me and said, are you Harry Veryser? I said, yeah. I had you in finance. He says, I'm a stockbroker. He said, my clients and I would like to thank you for your teaching of the Austrian trade cycle. And I've had time after time people come up to me and say, I had you in class, and we remember that Austrian theory, and I got out in time. And so I think it's going to become a very powerful tool in the success of future investment and in business. And the academy will only come to it grudgingly.
Harry, if you had an interested young person here with us now, and he wanted to know about the Austrian business cycle theory, what would you tell him?
Well, I would say, if you there are certain indications, as you can tell. The first indication, if you're thinking about it, I mean, obviously I tell them to read my book because I have that's my largest chapter in the book is on that theory. But I tell them there are certain indications. Number one, when politicians start telling you that they've beaten the trade cycle, sell your stock because they do it all the time. This is wonderful. We've got universal prosperity. Of course, it's all backed up by funny money, And then you have, I said, the second thing is when banks start advertising to make loans. That's another indication. And of course, the real indicator, which I've done some work on, is the reversal of the yield curve. When short-term rates rise above long-term rates, get out immediately, because that's almost a signal that happens all the time. And I've been doing more and more research into that, why that's the case. And but it's a fact, and you can see it because there's a scramble for cash. And boy, when that happens, interest rates go up, but those short-term interest rates go above long-term interest rates. And the best thing to do is get out, get into cash immediately.
Harry, how does the government, how does the Federal Reserve go about creating the business cycle?
Well, what they do is, of course, they do something which I consider to be completely unnatural. Okay, the natural economy is I produce goods and services, I produce stuff, and I trade that for other people's stuff. I mean, it's just a simple statement of Say's law. What they're doing is they're artificially putting spending power in, but no stuff. So what's happening is that they're inflating, and of course the point of inflation, the point of this artificial stimulus is the commercial banking system, and it goes into capital goods, and it starts to inflate the prices of capital goods. Now we're seeing a little bit of that now with the housing market. There's kind of a revival, not a strong one, but you're starting to see this the Federal Reserve's hand in that, and also in the stock market. And they're starting to inflate that currency, and it's setting up all kinds of malinvestments that are later going to come to haunt us. And so I would say it's the Federal Reserve unnatural interference with the regular economy by inflating the currency, or actually inflating the supply of credit, supply of monetary substitutes. And as they do that, they're going to create another mess. How long that mess will take to come to the surface, I don't know, but I would say probably a little bit sooner than later.
Well, Harry Veryser, thanks for coming on the show today. I'm going to mention one thing that you never mentioned about yourself. So not only is Harry a very successful teacher and scholar, he's also a successful businessman. So he puts all of this stuff into practice too, and very successfully. So Harry, thanks for all you do. Thanks for all the students that you've influenced over the years. Thanks for your new book. We'll, of course, have an Amazon widget up for it so people can order it. It didn't have to be this way. Why boom and bust is unnecessary, and how the Austrian School of Economics breaks the cycle. Harry, thank you.
Thank you, Lew.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
Well, thanks so much for listening to the Lew Rockwell Show today. Take a look at all the podcasts. There have been hundreds of them. There's a link on the upper right-hand corner of the LRC front page. Thank you.